thank you also thank you from me to the organizers and to you being my audience. You're not my usual audience. I mainly work in the contemporary present time. So I'm excited to share a little bit of the research that I've been doing, which has taken me way far into the past from what I'm normally at. I'm a cultural studies researcher, perhaps walking in a bit of a similar shoes like Karina, neither performer nor expert in this field. So I'm also hoping to get your feedback, get your thoughts on this material. In terms of methodology, I'm working with aesthetic anthropology in the most of the time, and my primary interests are kind of the connection between music and politics, art and politics. Working on my current project, which is a manuscript on contemporary brass music in Dresden, I have stumbled upon a couple of archival resources that, thanks to the Stadtmuseum Dresden and the Staatsarchiv, I've been able to kind of work through more, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. As I was working through working my way through the Staatsarchiv, I found a program booklet from the 20th anniversary of the Saxonian Military Association of former Marine troops, and the curator there and I found it quite interesting, because in this booklet, among the pieces shared is a march that, coming kind of from a contemporary perspective, caught my eye immediately. And that is the so-called Südwestafrikanischer Reitermarsch. We see it kind of in a succession of various other pieces that might be more familiar to you. However, I asked her, I was like, what is this? I've never heard of this. Seems very colonial to me. And why are we finding this in this 1928 program booklet? She didn't have any answers. I didn't have any answers. And what kind of further made it interesting is that Helmut Hieke, which was a very popular musician at the time, was also involved in this performance. And as you might have noticed in the very beginning, when I showed you the first page, that this concert took place in Dresden and in the Dresden-Neustadt district, which is located close to the Albertstadt, which is where the garnison used to be located at. And also, it was performed by the so-called Stahlhelm-Kapelle. So quite a lot of various things that, from my perspective at least, raised a lot of questions. So these questions raised the curiosity for me, is like, why was this terminology used in this program booklet? What was the meaning of using this form in this particular time and in this particular setting? So when I was starting my research to find an answer to those questions, I stumbled upon a book by Joachim Törchen-Bittler on the Armeemärsche, Geschichte unserer Marschmusik, dritter Teil, from 1973. And in that book, he mentions that it was a very common practice to name marches according to the colonies in which they were performed. So in the German case, we are talking about Namibia today and the German Southwest African colony. That practice had a very important function, and in particular because it had a symbolic function, right? So the songs would be named according to a place in order to establish a relationship to that particular place, kind of a notion of ownership of a place through music, and also to honor the troops and the imperial nature of the project, to honor the weight of the colonial mission that was resting on the shoulders of soldiers, but also of the settlers who were listening to this material. We'll go through a couple of things where we see that. So Törchen-Bittler kind of said that renaming songs was part of a practice of colonies establishing their own orchestras as well. In the case of German Southwest Africa, which is a term I'm going to use throughout this presentation, please note it's a very sensitive term. We're talking about Namibia today. It's a colonial term, but as this is a historical situation, just want you to recognize it that way. In the case of this particular German colony, I was not able to find any record that would show us an arrangement of this particular piece. I couldn't find also information how it was trained or people were educated to perform. However, in the Deutsche Kolonialzeitung, we find various instances that sharing and renaming marches in other colonies, such as Cameroon or Togo or Deutsch Ostafrika, was very common and also reported back to the homeland. The more and more I looked into this march, I found that it was really it seemed to have a very specific role in that moment. And as Pascal Grosse, which is a contemporary scholar working on colonialism and imperialism in Germany, says that we must understand the various phases and ways and symbolisms of German colonialism as an early precursor for the racial politics that we later see in Nazi Germany, and in following Carolin Mu, also music and sound's particular role in this process. So in Nazi Soundscapes, she explains that colonial fantasies continue to facilitate concepts of German nationalism and identity, and I quoted that from her. We have a lot of this information in terms of literature. We have a lot of information in terms of reports, but we don't have a lot of information in terms of music. So I found that quite unique to find that by chance, and I hope perhaps in conversation with you we can get more to this. So that's why I also titled the presentation as a Neocolonial Appropriation. And just to give you an idea of how I proceeded is basically I've been working with newspapers. So as you can see, those are the kinds of newspapers I consulted, and I was able to do a text-based keyword search to look for any other occurrences of this particular march at various times throughout quite a long period. Besides, so all of these were suggested by the Sächsische Staatsuniversitätsbibliothek Dresden, where there's an expert, Dr. Ines Pampe. And then as I was going through it, I also added the Bote von Geisingen-Müglitztal, the Eibenstocker Tageblatt, and the Sächsische Volkszeitung, which actually brought me out of the city into all of the provincial areas around it. And interestingly, most of the relevant pieces that I found were in the peripheries. They were not necessarily inside the city, so we're talking about rural performances, smaller towns and villages. So the first aspect that I found out is, like I said before, there was no transcription of this march. We're actually not talking about this particular march, we're actually talking about renaming of the Finnish Reitermarsch, which has various names that you can see on the slide. Here you find a contemporary transcription with a contemporary text, or like that you can find right now. And I also was able to identify or find a recording which was done after World War I, or during World War I, to mobilize the troops on a historical blog, which is an important source for this project. Because the majority of information about this project comes from community sources. So newspapers is one, and the other ones is organizations that have been traditionally engaged with this colonial heritage, and they're keeping this type of information throughout generations in order to work through the past or just to keep record. So let's hear it, it's very short. songbook that I showed you was one in German language. However, there's numerous of this particular piece. For example, the one by Zacharias Topelius, who composed for Finnish in 1872. There are at least 6 different names under which the song is commonly performed in Germany, in Sweden, and in Finland. That you can see here. And then we might even add the title of the Südwestafrikanischer Reitermarsch that I found in the sources. I brought to you a very simply Google translated version from this Finnish text. There is none that I was able to find, but in essence, the march talks about the Hakapelita, which is a Finnish soldier working on riding on horseback during the 30-year war, fighting for Sweden. And it talks about the hardships of the soldier, but also of the strong connection to the homeland, the longing, and this fighting at a distance. So these themes are going to be relevant. In 1891, the song was adapted by the Prussian army and has since been a standard in German military brass music, and it also remains an honorary march of the Finnish army and the defense command, as well as various smaller regiments in Finland and Sweden. This march also has a very close connection to Saxony. It's actually been imported by the princess Charlotte of Sachsen-Meilingen in the late 19th century, and was reworked. I don't know how, I'm not able to tell you, by Friedrich Wilhelm Vogt in 1889. We know that it then became part of the Saxon Parade March repertoire, because I found instances in the 21st Uhlans Regiment, Emperor Wilhelm II in Chemnitz, and the 19th Hussar Regiment in Grimma, who had records that they were performing the piece. It's also mentioned in newspapers during the time to welcome Finnish and Swedish emperors and military, kind of as a way to extending a sense of community, of welcoming message. And also it's been made part of, it's been an important parade march for troops on horseback during public events, folk festivals, sport events, honorary ceremonies, and various parade marches. So when I was doing my research on newspapers, I found 24 occurrences of, or 24 mentions of this particular march, either under any of its names. And we kind of see the military events in yellow, sport events in greenish bluish, and other forms of music engagement like choir meetings in purple, and honorary ceremonies in red. So this kind of distribution shows that military performances and the marches used in other entertainment and community-related events was the most significant function. That's kind of how it worked for them. And often the march would be mentioned together with the other popular marches that you can see on the slide. I hope you can read it. If not, Kurfürsten-Reitermarsch, we have the Torgauer Reitermarsch, Moltke Reitermarsch, Färbeliner Reitermarsch, and Pappenheiner Reitermarsch. Färbeliner was the one most commonly performed alongside. I have brought 3 short examples for you to see how it was kind of described. So first we have a 1903, so we're not in the interwar years yet, example of the Dresden Men's Choir. The piece was performed among many others to resituate the experiences of the 30-year war, so there's this kind of memory building that was important in the minds of the audience, and to highlight the kind of suffering that was endured and championed. So this effective approach, so we're like tingling the emotions, of the march, the symbolism is exemplary in the following quote, translated by me: melodies from the time of the 30 Years' War, the March of the Finnish Cavalry, and the Pappenheim Fanfare are very cleverly used. In 1909, again, pre-interwar, we have the 13th anniversary celebration of the Youth Association, an evening filled with songs and performances that are meant to strengthen the German loyalty and that Germany will reach to new power in the world, and with the youth as its hope. So here we have the march, among other accompanying music. One less frequently mentioned, the Hohenfriedenberger Marsch, and kind of it's a sound to battle, and the youth will fight for the country's future. So we have quite of like these celebratory instances. And then we come to 1936, where we have a foundation ceremony of the administration building for the country's Farmers Association in Saxony. It was very hard to build this building. Everybody was under very much strenuous circumstances, but eventually everybody succeeded. The builders and the audience were exhausted, but the boost morale, the Finnish Reitermarsch, is giving the function as the march, the sound, of the agricultural production and management, and therefore kind of a new start forward. My observation corresponds to what Gunther Janoschke has been writing about the military associations in Saxony between 1863 and 1913, and that they have established and maintained a culture of remembering and commemorating experiences of war to negotiate local identities and national belonging. So we know that this culture already started in the 19th century and before, through and led by the complex process of nation building, the friction-ridden formation of a seemingly cohesive national identity where Prussian and Saxonian identity were merged, often to the detriment of kind of Saxonian identity under the umbrella of the Prussians. So military march music such as the Finnish Horseman's March was kind of can be considered as a merger, and it played a crucial role for this practice. However, this kind of identity formation, as Janoschke importantly states, happened vis-a-vis another. So with the emergence of this national sense of identity, not only social and political practices merged in Saxony, but also military ones, including the treatment of music. So we have über die allmähliche Entwicklung der deutschen Militärmusik mit besonderer Rücksicht auf Sachsen, published in 1897 by Franke. He says that since 1867, most Saxonian signal pieces were replaced by Prussian ones, and there was also simplification and professionalization of, for example, trumpet corps within the military ensemble, making it smaller, smaller number of professionals, and then more assistant musicians. Janoschke kind of observed the role of the military associations in this process, and they served as important spaces for place making. So making the city a place of the military, and also space making for this kind of military identity within various places throughout Saxony. So Suze, Anna Rayleigh, and Catherine Brucher write about this in terms of saying that specific elements of memory culture, a sense of having to re-establish oneself against another, against the French, against the Prussians, against this new idea of nation, is re-exercised and celebrated. So in the pre-war years, military associations started this process, but then it was even more important kind of throughout as political and war events got more hard to have these stable spaces within these associations, which is why people kept coming back. So Riley and Brucher kind of say that these communities tend to be produced through the musical work of banding. So this is the notion they use, a practice that according to them has particular relevance for marginalized communities, and the military associations and military bands in Saxony saw themselves as marginalized. Whether they actually were or not, that's a different story. They go on to say that banding provides powerful articulations and experiences of community in the places where the communities feel to have been overlooked. The argument I would like to make is that this banding through the Stahlhelm-Kapelle, which is what I'm going to get into now, was one form of that. We can see the Südwestafrikanischer Reitermarsch performance under this particular name as one form of banding, a continuation of an appropriative neocolonial memory culture in which the other, that is the so-called unsocialized colonized person, is constantly recreated kind of as an image, and altered and renegotiated through, we know, literature and reports, newspapers, but also military music performance. So basically we can say this performance can be considered a symbolic mirror to help construct the community and its imperial sense of home and power. So transformations of music in the German colonies was a common practice in line with Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm's overall goal of professionalizing the military, and that also took place in the colonies. We know, like I said before, of Cameroon and Togo, where we have accounts of how music was taught, and for more of that you can look at Martin Rempe's work on cultural progress in uniform. Rudolf Penz, which is one of the members of these commemorative groups, has written that after the colonial reign of German colonial reign was over in the 1920s and 30s, to kind of keep the colonial tradition alive and colonial history alive, we assume that these pieces were performed again, but again we have little evidence. So having this in this booklet in the 1928 is one of the very rare instances of having evidence. We also have reports from settlers that have experienced a march performance in the colonies, from which we know that it boosted morale, it was part of the daily routine, it helped them kind of orient themselves, establish a sense of communities with the colonized people. And you can kind of read it here yourself. In particular, he writes that he has never seen a march like this before, and he's seen other marches, and this completely changed, and they were basically very ridden from the harsh climate, they were having a hard time in the colonies, but nonetheless, they were on horse, they performed, and they had this incredible presence despite the way they looked. And he compares it to a march that a parade he had seen in Erfurt, where everybody looked fine, and that never had that kind of feeling for him. We also have two mentions of the Finnish Reitermarsch in the Kolonialzeitung, one in 1884 and one in 1897. No, I think it's 1894 and 1897, I numbered. And one is when the troops were sent from Hamburg to the colony, mentioning two particular trumpeters going with. And the other one is during the Kaiser's birthday, when the trumpet corps marches into Windhoek, which is the capital of Namibia today, and this is what you see in this image. So by the time the booklet that I found was issued, obviously Namibia was no longer a colony, because it was only a colony until 1915. However, in Germany, it was a very crucial time, because, as Florian Wagner argues, there was a fierce opposition to the Treaty of Versailles that was deeply felt in the society, and these opponents kind of asserted their nationalist position, as he explains, to criticize the colonial treatment of Germans by the French, reverse the dispossession, and regain power over former imperial mission. So Florian Wagner importantly observed that this quest was also an international supported quest, so there were various kind of scholars and people from around the world who argued that the dispossession was unjust. So such colonial revisionism spread throughout, and even officials in France were in support, and the argument led to a re-evaluation of Germany's position in the broader scope of the international community, which Wagner summarizes in this quote that you see, is that the readmission of Germany into the international community kept the German belief in the country's colonial future alive. Germany's past as an active and respected member of the international community of colonizing nations made its dream more likely, and so on and so on. But these nationalist groups also were trying to use the colonial heritage to mobilize new imperial quests. So we have, throughout the Kolonialzeitung, various mentions of trumpets, or this particular march that I've detailed here for you, and said the purpose of these mentions. So we kind of see that there has been a knowledge creation that took place pre-war years or during the colonial time that carried on through this kind of memory culture in these military associations. What I'm trying to say is that when we go, and I'm starting to come kind of towards the end, that when we have this performance by the Südwestafrikanischer Markt, by the Stahlhelm-Kapelle, which is kind of an ensemble of the Stahlhelm, which was kind of a veterans organization that didn't agree with the Weimar Republic politics and wanted to kind of bring back monarchism and not yet National Socialist, but later form kind of collided with them. What I'm trying to say is that these kind of militarized bourgeois political activism groups also did so by kind of bonding with these military organizations who had knowledge from the past to bring it back to the present. And because the Stahlhelm appeared during various performances in the 1920s in Dresden. There are a number of newspapers that I found, and banding through performing these popular marches was carrying cultural memory and drawing connections between the soldiers, former home, far from home, very close to the present, the then present. In line with Florian Wagner, I would say that this booklet gives us a glimpse of how colonial experiences resurfaced in music in post-colonial times, and that's very similar to what we already know about British context. However, I think what we might also say is that it shows us kind of how sound and the renaming of sound and the naming and the banding and the branding of the banding played a role for how senses of communities in kind of through participation was created. And that it was part of what Susanne Santop calls seductive fantasies of domination that are provided through these kind of representations and the former lived past in the colonies. So why am I saying that? I think this might be a nice lesson for like a cultural history writing. How should we look at these sources? And that's why I tend to go to Fanon when we try to understand like what they are doing or kind of colonial, anti-colonial tensions that are going on in the interwar years. We it might be hard to decipher all the various complexities and specific practices. And when we speak of anti-colonial practices in the interwar years, we have to be mindful that they felt the oppression, but they were also trying to go against the oppression to oppress someone else. And I think that's an important aspect that we cannot forget. And there's an issue, I think, especially when we talk about how it also goes back to, and I didn't have time to go to Helmut Hickel as much, but he played until the 1950s in the Sächsische Staatskapelle, and he was then performing in 1928. So these things have trajectories, and there's an issue with glorifying particular kind of changes of historical elements, and there are ways, I think, that we give music a messianic function often, and that also has its issues, and as Emmanuel Chukwueze says, they can produce catastrophes, and I think it's important that we look at that. And I'll leave it at that. So thanks, and these are my sources.